Money is the root of all evil. If we just got rid of it, we would solve every problem in the world. Are you serious? Money is the only thing that keeps this world working. You like your iPhone, don't you? We can't live or work or have without money. Everywhere we look, it feels like money rules the world. Does money actually rule the world? Has hoarding massive amounts of wealth always been the goal? Haven't we always wanted to live like kings? The short answer is kind of, but not exactly. Maybe that's not the answer you were expecting. It genuinely wasn't mine when I started looking into this. Most of my content on here and back when I was streaming on TikTok focused on media. How we relate to it, how it shapes us, and how financial interests quietly shape what does get made. But money is its own subject. I hadn't thought to explore that specifically. But in my last video, when artists portray their art, and I suggested using the library as a way to avoid financially supporting artists whose choices you can't get behind. A few commenters pushed back on something I hadn't considered. The library doesn't actually stop money flowing to those creators, at least not entirely. That surprised me. I never once thought of the library as a financial transaction. Free has always just meant free. So that sent me down a rabbit hole. I did a live stream and then I did some more research and I kept coming back to the same question. How does this whole money in exchange for things system actually work? And did it always work this way? Because money shapes a lot. It shapes how we feel about ourselves. It can determine how our lives look. And it even really can affect how other people see us. Socially, money has long equated to power, and having it was always the goal.
Right?
So, does money actually rule the world? Disclaimer, I'm not an economist. I'm not an expert. I'm just a curious person, and I thought this might be interesting to more people than just me. So let's find out together. Today, we're doing a brief video. Today, we're doing a bit of a history of money and two economic systems that shaped the world we live in now, including why money, or more specifically, the accumulation of too much of it, gets blamed for so many of the world's problems. First, are you a fan of deep dives into the ins and outs of what makes our world tick? Then you're in the right place. From storytelling, pop culture, science, history, politics, and current events, I like to throw a little bit of everything into the mix. I love to explore all of the contextual threads that make our world ours. All resources will be listed in the description and my source notes. Just a quick warning, I will be briefly discussing the concept and topic of slavery, as well as some of the history of the beginning of the slave trade. So if that is not something you're interested in today, or it's not something you are comfortable with right now, that's okay. I will see you in my next video. But if that does sound like your jam, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps small creators like me. Before we get into the history, let's actually define the two terms of the economic systems we're going to be discussing today, because they get used
interchangeably
all of the time, and that is part of the problem. First, commerce. At its core, it's the exchange of goods, services, or currency to meet a need. It's ancient, so old, we don't have a start date for it, and it's local. The goal is to serve a community that it operates within, not to produce more than that community actually needs. Second, capitalism. It's something else entirely. It's not just an economic practice, it's an interconnected system. It requires and reinforces other social structures to function. Legal systems, government, patriarchy, colonialism, and religious doctrine. And unlike commerce, capitalism is young. While its roots trace back to mercantilism in 13th through 16th century feudal Europe, most historians point to the Industrial Revolution, and specifically Adam Smith's book Wealth of Nations, written in
1776,
as the moment it became the dominant framework. But there is something important to keep in mind. We have commerce now inside capitalist systems. Lots of it. Think of Depop, Etsy, Facebook Marketplace, any small artist selling their creations through their Instagram bios, social media handles, your
uncles, friends, cousins, girlfriends, best friends,
sister selling handmade goods at a local farmer's market. That's commerce. There are actually 7 types, defined by who's exchanging what with whom. Let's talk about what those are. First is business to consumer, or B2C. B2C refers to a business selling a product to a consumer. So if you buy a shirt from a department store, or you buy headphones or AirPods or whatever. Second is B2B, which is business to business, when businesses sell products to other businesses. So it could be commodities or raw goods, products that a company uses to conduct its business, like laptops for employees or phones or cars, or products purchased wholesale that the company intends to sell in the retail market. Third, business to administration, or B2A, sometimes referred to as B2G, which is business to government. This is when businesses sell products or services to government organizations. Fourth is consumer to administration, or C2B, is when an individual consumer provides something to a government organization. 5 is consumer to consumer. C2C commerce is characterized by individual consumers trading with each other in a decentralized way. 6th, consumer to business, or C2B. C2B is characterized by an individual consumer creating value for a business. So like influencers fall in the category. Even influencers on YouTube, they create business, they create value for YouTube. Another example would be a consumer participating in a business's focus group. Basically, a influencer or a individual who is promoting a product on behalf of a larger business. And the last is direct to consumer. DTC. That is a business model characterized by manufacturers selling their products directly to end customers, cutting out the middleman of retailers, distributors, wholesalers, etc. These manufacturers interact directly with customers and learn about their specific wants and needs. That's a lot. And a lot of it sounds like capitalism, right? Or at least that's what I thought capitalism was. That's because capitalism absorbed commerce and built on top of it. Almost every major brand you can name, Dior, GM, L'Oreal, Coca-Cola, Nestle, any of them, started as a small exchange between a person and a community need. So what actually differentiates commerce from capitalism? There's actually 3 things. First is age. Commerce is ancient. Like, it's the oldest sibling. Girl, what are you doing? It's kind of like the oldest sibling who moved out when you weren't even an idea yet. The phrase I saw the most when researching this was as old as time. Capitalism is not. Capitalism is a baby by comparison. Maybe 250 years old, maybe a little older, might have youngest child syndrome. 2 is scope. Commerce is a practice. Capitalism is a network of systems. So it requires social buy-in across law, government, culture, and more to function. Third is values. Commerce is built around relation, trust, collective need, and local rules. The Code of Hammurabi, which were 282 laws carved into stone around 1752 BCE, is our oldest known legal code, and a huge portion of it governs fair commercial exchange. Capitalism operates on a different value set entirely, and historically, it has had to replace the existing values of any community it entered in order to operate. So commerce has a ceiling. The goal is to meet the need without waste, to produce what the community actually needs or actually uses. There's no incentive to stockpile because the local economy doesn't need the excess. Capitalism doesn't have that ceiling. In fact, a ceiling is the enemy. Capitalism requires constant expansion to function. Just enough isn't a viable model. You need more to sell to more people in more places. And to make that work, you need to shift what people on a grand scale believe is important. What counts as success and what counts as enough has to radically change. Like, why do all that?
A lot of work. What's the point?
Consider Coca-Cola, Nestle, or General Mills. They quietly acquire smaller brands. They're accumulating ownership, or even things that might not have been possible to own in a traditional localized economy. The thing that's being owned doesn't need to be physical. It doesn't need to be tangible, because what's really being accumulated is control, dominance of the market. That's an alien concept to commerce. The thing commerce can't do. Capitalism, though, was built to. Okay, so we know capitalism needs expansion, and commerce is super old. But if commerce is that old, how did we go from bartering goods and services to exchanging money. And what did people actually use as money? Because it can't have always been gold. Currency and money are not the same thing. Money is the concept. Currency is whatever a society agrees to use to represent it. And what people have agreed on across human history is, let's just say, currency has had a lot of different phases. Before currency existed, people bartered. Archaeologists have tracked evidence of exchange going back roughly 40,000 years. It's a long time. Starting in the Upper Paleolithic.
Upper Paleolithic.
When groups of hunters traded for the best flint and tools. If you didn't have any weapons or tools, you might have other things people really needed. So, say you have wheat and I have fish. We work something out. Sounds great, right? I can make bread and you can make sashimi. But wait a second, what if I want sashimi? This is where it can get a little inconvenient. Or say I can't catch any fish, or there's a bad crop this year and you don't have enough wheat to trade. You're stuck, I'm stuck, we all lose. Bartering works when two people need what the other has. That's called double coincidence of wants. And it doesn't always work out. So what did the Upper Paleolithic hunters do when weapons and tools just couldn't cut it? See what I did there? Yeah, no, okay.
I know that was
Or what a localized economy needs. As always happens with humans, we make stuff up to fill the gap. We came up with currency as an alternative for when I can't catch any fish and you can't harvest enough wheat. I wonder who did that first. Like, how did that conversation go?
Is it awkward?
I bet it was awkward. The Mesopotamian shekel is the first known form of currency, emerging nearly 5,000 years ago. But before that, people were already using what historians call commodity money, objects that had value both themselves and as a medium of exchange. And what kinds of objects? Made of copper, meteorites, obsidian, amber, lead ingots. Ingots. And even live animals like cows and shells. Lots of shells. The cowrie shell, from a mollusk found in the shallow waters of the Pacific and Indian Oceans, was first used as currency in China and went on to become the most widely and longest used currency in history. Shells in the form of wampum, tubular shell beads, were used as money by various Native American tribes. The Fijians used whale teeth, and the people of Yap Island, now part of Micronesia, carved enormous limestone discs that became their currency and remain part of the island's culture today. All of that worked because the whole community agreed it worked. That agreement is the only thing that's ever made any currency real. In China, bronze and copper imitations of cowrie shells were among the earliest forms of metal coins. And metal tool money, shaped like knives and spades, originated there before evolving into rounder, more recognizable shapes. Loki, can we bring that back though? Because I would love that. Little knives and spades is money? I would never spend any of it. I would just keep it.
Maybe that's a problem.
Chinese coins were often made with neat holes through the center so they could be strung together and transported easily. The leap from commodity objects to standardized coins was a big one. The Kingdom of Lydia, what is now modern-day Turkey, issued the first officially regulated coin under King Alates.
Aliates.
Around 610 BCE. They were made of electrum. Okay, I love that word. Why did it stop with all these cool money things? Why do we have paper now?
With dead white people.
Electrum is a natural mix of gold and silver shaped like beans and stamped with a lion, the royal symbol. Why does that matter though? Because a coin stamped by a government says, we vouch for this. This is worth what we say it's worth. That's when currency went from being a valuable item in of itself to being representative of something beyond that item. Currency became a symbol that everyone using it had to trust in an institution. Around the same time, in the 6th century BCE, the ancient Greeks began using the drachma, named after the Greek verb meaning to grasp. Coins popularized quickly because they solved so many problems at once. They were durable, portable, divisible, and their value could be verified. That allowed the localized economy to grow a lot. This is where things take another big step. The first paper money was created in China during the Song dynasty in the 11th century CE. The jiaozi, a type of promissory banknote that is recognized as the earliest form of paper money in recorded history. Paper money develops in two forms: drafts, which were receipts for value held on account, and bills, which were issued with a promise to convert to real money. Coins with value based on their metallic content. Most paper money currency could be exchanged at a bank or a treasury for a set amount of silver or gold. That was the gold standard. Paper money wasn't just paper. It was a note saying you had the right to actual gold sitting in an actual vault. The paper is just a stand-in. The gold standard served as the basis for international monetary systems from the 1870s to the early 1920s, and again from the late 1920s to 1932, and then again from 1944 until 1971. In 1944, representatives from 44 nations gathered at Mount Washington, a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and created a new international monetary system. Under it, countries fixed their exchange rates to the US dollar, and the United States promised to provide gold on demand in exchange for dollars at the official price of $35 per ounce. All the currencies pegged to the dollar, therefore, had a fixed value in terms of gold. That really spoke to how powerful of an economic system the US had built at the time, especially for such a new country. That all sounds great until it wasn't. That system collapsed because the US printed more dollars than it had gold to support, financing the Korean War, Vietnam War, and major domestic spending programs. On August 15th, 1971, in a nationally televised address, President Nixon announced the end of the US dollar's convertibility to gold.
I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
Which brought in the modern fiat currency era. What the heck is fiat currency? I thought fiat was a car. A cute car, but like...
The car?
Fiat money is government-issued currency that is not backed by a precious metal, nor by any other tangible asset or commodity. It has value only because the people who use it agree on its value and trust that it will be accepted by others as a means of payment. I'm going to say that again because it's kind of hard to grasp, especially in the economy and environment that we've all grown up in. Your money, the dollars, euros, pounds in your bank account, are worth something only because enough people collectively agree that it's worth something. There's no vault of gold to back it up. There's no physical object standing behind that number. It's just an institutional trust of a government saying this is legal tender. But it actually gets even more intangible. Think about your credit score. It's not a measurement of money you have. It's a score that predicts how likely you are to repay money you don't have yet. It determines what loans you qualify for, what interest rates you pay, sometimes even where you can rent. It shapes real-life consequences based on a speculative calculation of your financial future. Or the stock market, where the value of a company isn't necessarily tied to what it owns or earns today, but to what investors believe it might be worth in the future. A company can be worth billions and have never turned a profit. The number isn't measuring reality, it's measuring collective expectation. It's probably one reason Elon Musk is the richest man in the world, even though he has a very bad history when it comes to actually successfully earning profit for any of the companies he's worked for, or owns, or his bestie. NFTs and crypto are just further abstractions from that same idea. It's a lot of stress, danger, and obsession over something that is absolutely not real, but can change your life overnight based on what others think. It's like the worst high school prom queen race ever. So let's review a sec. We started with shekels, then cowrie shells, all naturally occurring physical objects that communities collectively decided had value in the place of an actual good or service that could be traded in a trade barter system and allowed trade to expand between different economies to increase the kinds of goods or services available to those economies. Then we got to limestone discs, gold coins, drachmas, all made out of precious metals of some kind. then paper notes, then paper bills that were stand-in for actual gold coins at a bank, to fiat paper, which normalized institutional governmental authority as the measure of value of an item, to digital currency and numbers on a screen, NFTs, and finally crypto, representing money that doesn't exist yet, used to make decisions about your present life. The only defining factor in that process was a reliance on collective belief. Everyone saying, okay, we all agree that we're going to use this in our systems. That's cool. That's the only thing. This is pretty important when it comes to talking about capitalism, because capitalism is the system that needed this abstract, intangible structure the most. Commerce works fine with cowrie shells or shekels or cows, but you can't build a global financial empire on cowrie shells. Numbers on screens, projected future value, ownership of concepts and brands and resources, that's a system that can expand infinitely because it's not actually tethered to anything physical in the first place. It reminds me of that scene from Sinners where Stack was so upset about the nickels. The form of currency being used in that situation was a resourceful way to overcome systemic racism and oppression through localized commerce. But in the capitalistic system they were all living in at that time and that we are living in now, that couldn't translate outside of the system of commerce the community had established, which meant that its value was severely reduced if you wanted to use it externally. Which brings me back to the question I started with. Does money rule the world? Or does our belief in money rule the world? And who benefits the most from keeping that belief intact? So far, I've explored the history of money, how it developed, and what it's turned into today. Currency becomes more intangible at each step, and we've established that capitalism needs that intangibility to grow by expanding, accumulating, and concentrating control. But how did this happen? Why did it happen? How did capitalism, which relies on replacing the values of the society it works in, manage to do that? How did it manage to overcome a system as old as time? Let's go back to medieval Europe, roughly the 9th through the 15th centuries. Feudalism was the dominant economic and political system of medieval Europe, built on a hierarchical structure of land ownership and obligations. How that structure is established is important. The feudal hierarchy worked like this. The monarch kept a portion of the land, or the crown, and granted the rest to nobles and the church. The church had multiple incentives to work closely with the ruling monarchy as well, instead of always serving as a system of checks and balances. They did sometimes, but it depended heavily on who wielded power within the church and who the kings were. The church would affirm a monarch's right to rule through concepts like the divine right to rule, which included absolutism, the idea that a monarch was answerable only to God or representatives of God on earth, and no human could question their rule or decisions. Higher nobles pledged allegiance to the monarch in exchange for their territory, then distributed their land among lesser nobility and serfs. Lesser nobles and knights pledged military service and still had rights, could acquire wealth, and had some room to move. Serfs had almost none of that. It's easiest to picture in a pyramid or a triangle. King at the top, high nobles next, lesser nobles and clergy in the middle, merchants under them, and at the base, the vast majority of the population, serfs, working land that they didn't own, producing value that they didn't keep, and protected by people they couldn't refuse without severe consequence. The serfs' working time was essentially split in two: the hours spent producing enough for their own survival and their families, and the hours spent producing surplus that went directly to the lord. That surplus, extracted through labor, goods, and eventually money, was the engine of the entire feudal economy. The lord didn't work the land, the lord owned the land, and by owning the land, owned the output of everyone who worked it. Land meant wealth, land meant power, and land was something the vast majority of people would never own. Sounds familiar. By the 13th century, the greater use of coin-based currency changed how the feudal system worked. Money allowed feudal lords to pay their sovereign instead of performing military service. Monarchs could now distribute money instead of land as rewards. As trade expanded and towns grew, new social classes emerged. A merchant class that gained wealth independent of land ownership. This shift challenged traditional feudal hierarchies and led to increased mobility as people sought opportunities beyond beyond agricultural labor. Even serfs, if they were careful and strategic, could sometimes buy their freedom. Over time, feudalism weakened. Early capitalism developed based on the coin-based currencies that gave rise to a mercantile class that was different from the traditional commerce economic structure that had operated before. Capitalism still had to utilize the long-standing norms of commerce to create the cracks necessary for a new system to develop, though. But there was one major change that allowed that crack to split wide open, and it has to do with what may have been the world's first corporations. But first, it's worth examining what's similar and what's not about medieval European feudalism and capitalism in our modern day and age. First, let's put the two side by side, because the structural parallels are hard to ignore. In feudalism, land was the ultimate resource. Who owned it determined who had power. The king and nobility owned it, everyone else worked it. In modern capitalism, the ultimate resources aren't fields, they're capital, infrastructure, intellectual property, now platforms, and data. Who owns those determines who has power. And increasingly, that's an extraordinarily small group of people. The CEO to worker pay ratio has gone roughly from 35:1 in the post-World War II era to 400:1 or more today. That ratio gets wider, not narrower, as the system matures. In feudalism, serfs were tied to the land, not legally free to leave without losing their livelihood and protection. In modern capitalism, workers are technically free to leave any job, but if the major employers in your field, region, or industry are owned by the same handful of parent companies, if your industry is dominated by a monopoly or near monopoly, how free is that freedom, really? If something goes wrong at one company, it can affect your ability to get hired at others. If those companies share owners, or it can make it very hard to get in the first place. You can choose your lord. It's not quite the same as not having one. Modern economies are increasingly refeudalizing into a hierarchical system of wealth, property, and power, which are reconcentrating in the hands of a corporate elite, while the majority exist in a more precarious and dependent state. We are all way closer to being unhoused than we are to being billionaires. The growing corporate ownership of housing is a direct example. The increasing consolidation of property by large investment firms and rising housing costs is creating a divide between an entrenched class of renters and a landed property owner class, undermining economic mobility. Renters paying an ever larger share of their income to landlords who own multiple properties, workers producing surplus value for companies owned by shareholders who don't work there. That's not entirely unlike serfs producing surplus for a lord who doesn't work the land. Under feudalism, political authority and economic power blended together. Feudal lords extracted surplus from peasants partly because the lords were the law that applied to the peasants in their jurisdiction. Today, large corporations do their best to influence government policy on behalf of wealthy shareholders, lobbying, writing legislation, funding campaigns, using revolving door hiring between regulatory agencies and the industries they regulate. That's concerning, to say the least. Now, it's still important to acknowledge that this comparison has its limits. It would be lazy analysis to not acknowledge that. The genuinely significant difference between feudalism and capitalism is, under feudalism, lords gained power through birthright, and the children of workers remained workers with almost no chance of progression. Capitalism, unlike feudalism, does not maintain those rules. A person can, in theory, change their fortune. The legal and social mobility capitalism offers is not nothing. People do move between classes. Businesses do grow from small to large. Innovation does occasionally disrupt entrenched power, at least for a while. But obviously there's still huge problems. Some analysts argue that the most powerful corporate leaders, Zuckerberg, Bezos, and many others, have moved away from competition and profit maximization and are now primarily focused on establishing monopolies and extracting rent. When you own the platform that everyone else has to sell through, you're not really competing in a market. You're charging tolls for access to a space you control. That's closer to a feudal lord charging passage fees than to a merchant competing on quality and price. There's actually a term that has gained traction in economic and political theory: neo-feudalism, or sometimes called techno-feudalism. Neo-feudalism refers to the theorized reemergence of policies and socioeconomic structures reminiscent of feudalism manifesting in modern times, with an elite ruling class consisting of powerful corporations, oligarchs, and a new no nobility, accumulating massive wealth and property. It's a contested term. Some economists argue it's technically inaccurate, that what we're seeing is still capitalism, just capitalism in a late stage monopolistic era, rather than a genuinely new system. But even critics of the term tend to agree on the underlying issue. The gulf between ordinary people and the techno-barons has become so vast that it feels qualitatively different. Not just a bigger version of normal inequality, but something that operates by different rules. And that feeling that the rules benefited people who don't have to follow the same rules to get where they are is exactly what made feudalism so destabilizing when people finally started to recognize the issues. Commerce and capitalism did give people a way out of feudalism. The question that we need to ask now is, how are we going to get out of this? I am going to address a couple of options and a couple of ideas towards the end of the video, so keep watching. Okay, so remember when a few minutes ago I said
There was one major change that allowed that crack to split wide open.
this is where I get into what that change was. It's about as awful as it can get. I've established that capitalism needed to dismantle feudalism's social values in order to take hold. I've established that it needed constant expansion, and that it required communities to believe that more is always better, that accumulation is the goal, and that the system rewards those who work hardest within it. But how exactly did all of that happen so fast? Capitalism had been the dominant social and economic structure of Europe for centuries, replacing its values, its hierarchies, its entire framework for how land, labor, and loyalty worked. Doesn't just happen overnight, just because a few merchants had a good idea that caught on. So what actually cracked open the entrenched system of feudalism? Short answer is slavery. The transatlantic slave trade, to be precise, with stolen land, stolen labor, genocide, and a system of racial hierarchy specifically constructed to make those things not just acceptable, but necessary. Before capitalism could expand to a global level, it had to dismantle how things worked locally. In countries like England, France, and the Netherlands, capitalism's early growth, especially as technology developed and led to the Industrial Revolution, ran on two tracks simultaneously. At home, people were being driven off of land that they had farmed for generations through legal enclosure methods, privatizing common land to make it yield more profit for capitalist landlords, and forcing displaced people into factories as wage laborers. That's the enclosure movement. And it's important because it's the domestic version of something that would be exported globally on a massive scale. For centuries under feudalism, common land existed across Europe. Fields, forests, and pastures that were collectively used by communities. The enclosure movement privatized that land. And what Marx, that guy, identified as a critical transformation was that it turned the feudal peasant into what he called a proletarian, someone who, having been robbed of land and any guarantee of subsistence, now had no choice but to sell their labor to survive. Let's look at what that means. Peasants under feudalism were exploited, absolutely, but they had some direct connection and relationship with the land that sustained them. After enclosure, that relationship was severed. Now they had to work for someone else to eat with nothing guaranteed. Land, no way to grow their own sustenance, nothing. The feudal lord extracted surplus from people tied to the land. The capitalist employer extracted surplus from people who had no land left to go back to. Historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz argues that colonialism actually served as an escape valve for this displacement. Peasants thrown off their lands in Europe were offered land where they could effectively be lord themselves. Poor settlers were, in her view, also duped by a system that handed them proximity to power while the real wealth flowed upward. The promise that made settler colonialism so effective wasn't just racial superiority, it was economic aspiration. You may be poor, but you can own your own land. You can be a lord, just somewhere else, on someone else's land. The material spoils of colonial accumulation worked to supercharge the end stage transformation of European economies from feudal to market-based. This is the part of capitalism's origin story that tends to get left out of the standard telling. The version most of us learned goes something like smart merchants created a new pathway out of serfdom, they developed new trade routes, competition drove innovation, which led to the Industrial Revolution, which led to our modern economy. It's linear, almost inevitable. But that story skips over what actually provided the capital, the land, and the labor that made the whole machine run. The advance of a worldwide market economy and capitalism provided the framework for transatlantic trade and the trade of enslaved people. In the 17th and 18th centuries, an economic system arose to be reinvested in the name of still greater profits. The first phase of what would later be called capitalism. The triangle trade enslaved Africans to the Americas, raw materials from the Americas to Europe, European goods back to Africa, wasn't a side story to capitalism's rise. It was capitalism's rise in one of the most concentrated and brutal forms. And what may have been the first corporations were created for this purpose. I've covered capitalism needing constant expansion and how colonialism was the mechanism that made that expansion possible. I've also talked about racial hierarchy as the ideology that justified it. But what was the vehicle? What was the actual organizational structure that carried all of that out? It was a corporation. And to understand what corporations actually are and where they come from, we need to talk about three companies that most people have heard of, but don't always know the history of. That's the British East India Company, the Dutch West India Company, and the Dutch East India Company. Because they weren't just trading businesses. They were, in very real ways, the first corporations and mega corporations in history. And what they did with that structure tells you almost everything you need to know about how capitalism operates at a grand scale. Let's go back to 1600. England was hungry for access to Eastern trade, spices, textiles, silk, but sea voyages to Asia were extraordinarily dangerous and expensive. Ships sank, pirates attacked, disease killed the crew, and the mortality rate for an employee of the Dutch East India Company was 30%. No individual merchant alone could afford to absorb that kind of risk. The solution they invented had disastrous consequences globally. The Dutch East India Company, known as VOC, founded in 1602, was the world's first publicly traded joint stock company, the first to issue shares on a formal stock exchange, and it's often cited as the first true multi-international corporation. The British East India Company was founded just like 2 years earlier in 1600, but it was the VOC that created the fully public tradable share model. So how did that work? Instead of one wealthy merchant funding one voyage and taking all the risk, the VOC pooled capital from hundreds of investors, not just wealthy merchants, but middle-class citizens, who each bought shares and received a portion of the profits in return. Risk was distributed, capital was pooled, and crucially, ownership was separated from operation. You didn't have to sail the ship to profit from it. You just had to own a piece of it. That separation of ownership from labor is one of the most consequential ideas in the history of capitalism. It's a structural DNA of every corporation that exists today. The VOC's estimated peak value in today's money exceeded 7.9 trillion, more than Apple, Microsoft, and Google combined.
Oh God.
They weren't corporations the way that we generally picture them today. They weren't just businesses operating within the laws of a state. They were effectively states, or at minimum, they operated with powers that we now associate with governments. The VOC could recruit and command armies, build fortresses, establish colonies, declare war and peace, and issue its own currency across its territories throughout Asia, Africa, and the Americas. The British East India Company was no different, with its private army numbering over 260,000 at its peak, more than twice the size of the British Army at the time.
It's just good business.
The company collected taxes, administered justice, and issued its own currency as well. It effectively operated as a sovereign state. So that's a corporation with a bigger army than the government that chartered it, collecting taxes, administering law, and governing territory. The EIC, for short, ultimately became a state within a state. Maybe you could even say like an empire within the British Empire. It was accountable to no one but its shareholders, not the people that it governed, not to the communities it operated in, in, not to any moral or legal framework beyond the one it found convenient, only to the people who owned pieces of it and expected a return. But there's more to this, because while the East India companies were reorganizing Asian trade and governance, another set of companies was doing something more directly catastrophic in the Atlantic. The Dutch West India Company, which was founded in 1621, was granted a monopoly on Dutch trade and colonization in the Americas and West Africa, including military powers to wage war, negotiate treaties, and establish colonies. Now, this is not the same as the Dutch East India Company. They both operated out of the Netherlands, but they were technically two separate companies. The company acquired ports on the West African coast, specifically to supply enslaved people or plantations in the West Indies and South America. One of its most significant operations was to capture the Portuguese slaving port of Elmina in present-day Ghana, which became a crucial node in the transatlantic slave trade. And the Dutch weren't alone. West India companies were chartered across Europe. There was Danish, French, and a Swedish version, and each had monopoly rights over their portion of the slave trade in the Atlantic. The transatlantic slave trade wasn't just happening, it was being organized, systemized, and corporatized, structured as a business with shareholders, dividends, risk management, and supply chains. This is where the entire idea of racial capitalism operated, and not as a theory, but like as an operational reality. The same corporate structure invented to pool risk and distribute profit from spice trading was being directly applied to the trafficking of human beings. Enslaved people were the commodity. The Middle Passage, which was the trade route that the ships would take, was the supply chain. The plantation was what a factory works as today. And somewhere back in Amsterdam or London, a shareholder was receiving a dividend and making money off of it. Let's go back to India, because these companies were not just called the British East India Company or the Dutch East India Company or the Dutch West India Company. They were actually operating within India and its surrounding countries. What happened there is one of the most disturbing and least widely known examples of what corporate power unchecked by accountability actually produces outside of the Americas. The East India Company extracted resources and imposed brutal tax policies in Bengal, directly exacerbating the Great Bengal Famine that happened from 1769 to 1770, which took anywhere between 1 to 10 million lives, roughly a third of Bengal's population at the time. How does a corporation cause a famine? At the peak of the crisis, the company continued exporting grain and prioritizing tax revenue over relief for the people who were creating that profit for them. Up to 10 million people lost their lives, not because of a war or a natural disaster, but because of a profit logic of a corporation that was only answerable to its shareholders. The EIC's monopoly on tea exports was also central to the Boston Tea Party of 1773, directly sparking the chain of events that led to the American Revolution. The founding of the United States is, in part, a story about colonial resistance to corporate monopoly power, which is ironic considering how America was founded as the United States in the first place and what American capitalism has become. Two leading thinkers of the era, including Adam Smith, remember we talked about him earlier with The Wealth of Nations? He published that in 1776. The East India Company's rise and fall highlighted three fundamental flaws in the corporate metabolism. First, the unrelenting drive to market domination. Second, inherent speculative tendencies. And third, the corruption of political systems by corporate interests. Adam Smith is widely considered the father of modern capitalism, and he was specifically warning about the East India Company and using it as a model for what corporations could become. He wrote that in 1776, and he was not listened to. It was profoundly ignored, because what the East India Company and the West India companies actually created became a template for how corporate structure could be used. It pioneered the idea of separate ownership from accountability, pooling capital from passive investors who never had to witness what their money was doing, constructing legal and governmental structures that protected profit extraction from any community recourse. You move that extraction across borders, and when one territory becomes too costly or too organized to exploit, you move it again. In Between Monopoly and Free Trade, the English East India India Company, Yale sociology professor and author Emily Erickson wrote, "It's hard to understand the global political structure without understanding the role of the company. I don't think we'd have a global capitalistic economic system that looks the way it does if England hadn't become so uniquely powerful at this point in history. They transitioned into a modern industrial force and exported that vision of production and governance to the rest of the world. That exported vision is still operating. The companies are different, the legal frameworks are more sophisticated, the violence is generally more economic than military, kind of, though obviously not always. But the structure, shareholders at the top, accountable only to each other, extracting value from people and places at the bottom, that structure was created by the West India Company slave traders. It's important to recognize that the present corporate structure inherited that structure, and that structures once built tend to keep working and keep doing what they're designed to do unless something deliberately changes them, just like how commerce was working until capitalism came in and shifted the entire moral structure. The United States is a particularly clear example of how this worked in practice, because it required two simultaneous and enormous acts of taking. The first was land. The extension of the United States from sea to shining sea was the goal of the country's founders. Free land was the magnet that attracted European settlers. But of course, that land wasn't free, and it wasn't empty. Indigenous nations lived in those territories, still do, and overt military force was routinely deployed to dispossess them. And worse, much worse, much worse.
Coercion.
Through laws, treaties, purchases, and seizures, often done through violence and coercion, colonial settlers and later the federal government acquired over 2 billion acres from different tribes. 2 billion acres. That is the land base on which the American economy was built. The second was labor. Millions of descendants of enslaved people born in the United States were subjected to abuse, violence, and forced labor. Even as the U.S. claimed an identity as a constitutional democracy founded on the belief that all people are created equal. Racialized slavery was ignored, defended, or accommodated by leaders while the new nation gained extraordinary wealth and influence in the global economy based on that forced labor. By mid-century, racialized chattel slavery had built not only a wealthy and powerful South, but it also given rise to an industrializing and diversifying North. In New England, new industries rose up alongside textile mills powered by slave-produced cotton. The wealth that seeded American banking, insurance, real estate, and manufacturing didn't materialize from innovation alone. It was extracted. The economic legacy of the transatlantic slave trade, including generational wealth and the founding of industries that continue to thrive today, is not what we learn in history class. The industries built on that foundation didn't disappear. They evolved, consolidated, and in many cases became the major institutions of American economic life. I know I've kind of thrown around the word racial capitalism pretty consistently throughout this video, so I want to explore it a little bit deeper. There's a really helpful framework for understanding this that a scholar, Cedric J. Robinson, actually explored. He says that racial capitalism is the concept that capital accumulation within capitalism is achieved in significant part through the extraction of social and economic value from people of marginalized racial identities. Robinson first articulated this in his 1983 book, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, arguing that all capitalism is inherently racial capitalism. What Robinson was saying, and what his student Robin D.G. Kelly later also clarified, is that race and racism aren't accidental features of capitalism that got attached to an otherwise neutral system. They are foundational. Robinson argued that capitalism emerged from racial hierarchies that already existed, not the other way around. For Robinson, capitalism was racial, not because of some conspiracy to divide workers or justify slavery or dispossession, but because racialization had already permeated Western feudal society. Yes, feudal society, all the way back in like the 9th to 15th centuries. Capitalism and racism didn't break from the old order, they evolved from it. It means that racism wasn't an accident. It wasn't something that we could theoretically remove while keeping capitalism intact. It was part of the architecture from the beginning, the mechanism that made it possible to define entire populations as available for exploitation, dispossession, or elimination in the service of accumulation. I think it's important to keep that in mind mind when we look back at the history of the Dutch East India Trading Company and West India Trading Company and the British East India Trading Company, because they were able to operate and exploit the countries and peoples they did because of this racialized capitalism. So once capitalism was established, again, built on stolen land, on stolen labor and racial hierarchy, it didn't stay contained. It needed to keep expanding. Remember, that's the core requirement. It has to keep growing. It has to keep getting bigger. Otherwise, it can't operate. And when domestic labor becomes more organized, more expensive, and more legally protected, the system had to find a new solution. It went to its roots. It moved. During the 1980s and the 1990s, the IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, which I acknowledged when we were talking about the gold standard from 1944 that was created at the Bretton Woods conference, operated as an international financial system to promote global economic stability, facilitate international trade, and provide financial assistance to countries in economic crisis. In practice, it looked like a country that might be in serious financial trouble, that can't pay its debts, its currency is collapsing, its economy is in free fall, could apply to the IMF for emergency loans. Then the IMF, which is funded by 190 member countries, with wealthier nations contributing more and therefore having more voting power, would then help bail them out. And the one catch with that was they would then institute structural adjustment programs. So what that would mean is the countries that were able to receive an IMF loan would have to privatize public services like water, electricity, and healthcare. They'd have to cut government spending and public sector jobs. They'd have to open their markets to foreign investment, and they'd have to reduce or eliminate trade protections for local industries, as well as deregulate labor markets, suppressing wages and worker protections. We can definitely see how that is a problem and what that could open those countries up to. By this point in history, multiple countries throughout the global south have been directly affected by colonialism, all the way back from the 1600s, and it heavily influenced their ability to thrive and to participate in international trade, as well as the capitalist systems of the largest and most powerful nations. So the IMF implements structural adjustment programs, which open those countries to capitalism, especially if those countries had not been utilizing capitalism and instead utilizing commerce more consistently. It allowed capitalist nations to bring in forced foreign investment. Trade agreements like NAFTA slashed tariffs that had once protected local farmers in developing nations from competition with industrialized agribusinesses. Farmers driven off their land by cheap imports found themselves in cities already filled with workers whose jobs had been eliminated by privatization and austerity. So, people displaced from land they'd farmed for generations, forced into wage labor with no alternatives. I feel like we've seen this before. Export processing zones, areas where foreign capital enjoys tax exemptions and access to cheap, often non-unionized labor, grew from 79 in 25 countries in 1975 to over 3,500 in 130 countries by 2006, employing around 66 million workers. The International Labor Organization found that roughly 80% of those zones paid wages below the national minimum wage. Global supply chains are used not just to exploit labor in the global south, but to pressure workers in wealthier countries to accept worse conditions too, under threat of their work being outsourced. Downward pressure on wages in one part of the chain generates pressure on everyone else. That's the mechanism. It's not just that corporations moved jobs overseas to pay lower wages, it's that they created the option as a tool to suppress wages for workers and power everywhere. Today, impoverished countries are structurally dependent on foreign investment and must compete with each other to offer cheaper labor and resources to please international finance, ensuring a steady flow of disposable goods and fast fashion to wealthy consumers at extraordinary cost to human lives and ecosystems. So let's go back to my original question. Does money rule the world? I think it's a little bit more specific. A particular system around money does rule the world. One that has required at every stage of its development the destruction of existing communal relations to land and resources, and the construction of racial categories to determine whose labor, land, and life could be taken without legal or moral consequence. And that includes the ongoing export of those same dynamics to new geographies whenever the previous ones become too organized or too costly to exploit. The enclosure of English commons and the colonization of the Americas aren't separate stories. The transatlantic slave trade and the Industrial Revolution aren't separate stories. The IMF structural adjustment programs and the sweatshop economy it produced aren't separate stories. centuries. It's the same again and again and again. Feels overwhelming, doesn't it? But that's exactly why it's so important to examine. When people say that capitalism has a racism problem or a colonial problem or an inequality problem, they're pointing at symptoms. What the history shows is that these aren't problems that crept into an otherwise clean system. They were the conditions that built it. Understanding that is perhaps the first step to understanding what it would actually take to change it. Okay, so I've talked about a lot of different things and technically have spanned centuries upon centuries of history in a relatively short amount of time. So let's review a bit. We've talked about commerce, capitalism, history of currency, feudalism, racial capitalism, colonialism, outsourcing of exploitation, the development of the first mega corporations, how the IMF has affected the global south, a lot. And if you've made it this far, you're amazing. Thank you. I am sorry. You're probably wondering the same thing that I was when I was going into a despair pit while researching this. Now what? Here's the thing about understanding the system clearly. So if capitalism isn't just a neutral economic tool that occasionally gets misused, but a system built from the start on specific values, hierarchies, and acts of taking, then tweaking around the edges isn't really going to feel like much of a response or like it will be able to change anything. But blowing the whole thing up tomorrow isn't really an option either. Billions of people's lives and livelihoods are wired into the system, including you and me, whether or not we like it. So what does a genuine alternative actually look like? Let's think about it. Let's explore. Remember our original definition of commerce? Commerce at its best is the practice of meeting community need through exchange grounded in local relationships, collective trust, and the principle of producing what's actually needed rather than endlessly producing more. The goal isn't to go back to cowrie shells, but if we recovered the values underneath commerce, sufficiency over excess, relationships over extraction, local accountability over distinct ownership, and we built forward from those values using what we actually know now, I think we have a really good chance for building something so much better, which it turns out a lot of people are already doing. It's called the solidarity economy. The solidarity economy includes indigenous approaches to sustainability, cooperatives, community land trusts, credit unions, peer lending, mutual aid, community-supported agriculture, fair trade, and the informal ways in which families, friends, and neighbors come together to help each other. It can work on an international scale too. The solidarity economy can be understood as operating across 5 spheres. First, worker cooperatives for production, time banking, fair trade, and basic income for distribution, housing and food cooperatives, and community land trusts for consumption, credit unions, public banking, and alternative currencies for finance, and participatory budgeting, commons ownership, and restorative justice for government. What that means in practice is rather than replacing capitalism with one giant alternative system overnight, which is both politically impossible and historically dangerous, you build parallel structures that operate on different values within the existing economy and grow them until they're large enough to reshape it. Uno reverse. So let's talk about what some of these things actually look like, starting with worker cooperatives. Worker cooperatives may be the most coherent alternative to capitalism as we know it, because they put capital at the service of labor rather than the other way around. Instead of shareholders extracting profit from workers, the workers are the owners. They vote on decisions, share in profits, and have real democratic control over the workplace. This isn't theoretical. The Mondragon network in the Basque country of Spain has over 70,000 worker owners. Thousands of worker cooperatives operate in Italy's Emilia-Romagna region. These cooperative economies have demonstrated the ability to provide stable, long-term opportunities for inclusive growth. I actually covered this co-op on a TikTok live a few months ago. In the US, REI, the outdoor gear company, is a consumer cooperative. Credit unions are member-owned financial cooperatives. The Evergreen cooperatives in Cleveland, Ohio, are worker-owned businesses operating in one of the city's lowest socioeconomic neighborhoods, intentionally structured to keep wealth circulating locally rather than extracting it. They aren't fringe experiments. They're operating right now at a real scale. Remember how we said land was a currency of feudalism and how the enclosure movement, privatizing common land, was the first act of building capitalism? Community land trusts are essentially a direct counter to that. Community land trusts are nonprofit organizations that acquire and hold land in a trust for the benefit of the community, ensuring it is used for permanent affordability and community good, housing, urban agriculture, or commercial space. They protect against gentrification and speculative real estate markets by keeping housing prices affordable control over the long term, with decisions about land use made by community members rather than absentee landlords or developers. Long held in common, managed by the people who live on it for the long-term benefit of the community. That's not a radical new idea. It's actually very old. What's new is doing it within a legal and institutional framework that protects it from being re-enclosed. Now, let's talk about credit unions and public banking. Your bank extracts value from you. It takes your deposits, loans them out on interest, and returns a fraction of that to you while shareholders keep the rest. A credit union does the same basic thing. It takes deposits, makes loans, but is owned by its members. Profits go back to the members in the form of lower fees, better rates, and community investment rather than to distant shareholders. Public banking goes further. Several US cities and states are exploring or have implemented public bank, financial institutions owned by the public whose profits go back into public services rather than private hands. For example, the Bank of North Dakota, founded in 1919, has operated profitably for over a century. Now, let's zoom out, because the individual tools only get you so far if the underlying logic of the system stays intact. This is where a concept called degrowth comes in. And I want to be mindful of how I explain this because I think it's a pretty misunderstood concept in the current economic space. Economic anthropologist Jason Hickel defines degrowth as a planned reduction of energy and resource use designed to bring the economy back into balance with the living world in a way that reduces inequality and improves human well-being. The first thing most people think when they hear that is shrink the economy. We're going to lose all our money. We'll go into recession. That's not what it means. Degrowth does not call for universal shrinking or shrinking everything generally. It calls for a conversation about what sectors still need to grow, like renewable energy, public services, healthcare, what sectors are big enough already, and what sectors are too big and need to significantly shrink. Fossil fuels, fast fashion, planned obsolescence, private jets, industrial beef, police budgets. And a recession is an unplanned economic reduction with unmanageable impacts. Mass unemployment and worsened inequality is a huge part of it. Degrowth is a planned policy that scales down environmentally degrading and less essential production. One is chaos, the other is a choice. And crucially, degrowth research in ecological economics is clear that decommodifying public goods and de-enclosing commons enables people to access what they need to live well without needing high incomes to do so. Think more community gardens, which also means less pressure to work excessive hours and produce unnecessary things. In other words, if healthcare, housing, education, and childcare weren't things you had to individually afford, you'd need a lot less money to live well. And if you needed less money to live well, the pressure to participate in an economy of constant growth and consumption just to survive would drop significantly. That's the logic. It's less about shrinking abundance and more about redefining what abundance actually means. It doesn't have to be things, it could be community. Economist Kate Raworth offers a related framework called donut economics, and the image is actually useful. The donut has an inner ring, the social foundation that everyone should have access to, things like food, housing, education, and healthcare, and then it has an outer ring, the ecological ceiling, planetary boundaries we cannot exceed without catastrophic consequences. The goal is to operate in the ring between them, enough for everyone without destroying the systems that make life possible. In 2020, Amsterdam became the first city to officially adopt donut economics as its guiding framework, deciding to use it as its model for recovering from the pandemic. Copenhagen, Brussels, Dunedin in New Zealand, and Nanaimo in British Columbia have since followed. In the US, Portland, Oregon, and Philadelphia have joined the Thriving Cities initiative, experimenting with ways to meet residents' needs sustainably. But there's more to transitioning away from capitalism than just alternatives. Because it's not just a policy problem, it's a values problem. And we've been building those current values, at least in the US, for 250 plus years. Capitalism didn't just change the economy. In order to change the economy, it had to change the values of the people in that economy. So that meant that what people believed was important, what counts as success, what counts as enough, what counts as a good life, all of that had to change to fit into what would make capitalism work. Reversing that isn't done with a single election or a single law. It's done sort of in the way that capitalism did it, gradually, through culture, through community, through what people come to see as normal. The enclosure movement worked because it changed people's relationship to land over generations. The transatlantic slave trade worked worked because it constructed an entire racial ideology to justify itself as normal and necessary. Capitalism's expansion globally worked because it used institutions, the IMF, trade agreements, debt, to make its values the default. Changing defaults works the same way in reverse, slowly, from the bottom up, and simultaneously at multiple levels. It has to work on an individual, community, institutional, and political level. And it sounds exhausting, but there's reason to be hopeful. The alternatives aren't waiting to be invented. They already exist. Worker cooperatives, community land trusts, credit unions, mutual aid networks, solidarity economies, degrowth cities. These are operational right now, and they're growing. Real-world experiences have shown that significantly higher concentrations of demographic workspaces are possible with the proper support and incentive ecosystems. The question isn't whether these models work. The question is whether enough people will know they exist and choose to participate in them and build political will to support them on a large scale. And that right there is where it comes back to you. I started this video arguing with myself about money. I was asking the wrong question. Money is a tool. Currency is a technology. Commerce is a practice as old as human community. None of these things are inherently a problem. Problem is a specific system built at a specific historical moment using specific mechanisms of violence and dispossession that replaced an older set of values with a single overriding one. Accumulation above all else. More is always better. Growth is always the goal. And anyone who controls enough of what others need can set the terms for everyone else. That system is not natural. It's not the logical endpoint of human civilization. It's a choice. One that was made at a particular time by particular people for particular reasons. And choices can be made differently. Commerce existed for tens of thousands of years before capitalism. Is, in many forms, still existing today. What it looks like when it's working isn't a fantasy. It's a farmer's market where the sellers know their customers by name. A credit union where interest stays in the community. A workers' cooperative where the people doing the labor are also the people making the decisions. A neighborhood land trust where families can't be displaced by a speculative real estate bubble because the land was never for sale in the first place. All that to say, it's totally possible and it is happening right now. So, does money rule the world? It does, if we keep agreeing that it should. Maybe you can make a different choice. Thank you so much for jumping into my video today. This was a very different style, very different topic than I have tackled before, but I am glad that I got an opportunity to explore this, and I hope you enjoy it as well. If at any point there's something within this video that you have questions about or you'd like to discuss, please let me know in the comments below. Also, I do live stream weekly on Wednesdays, and I will be doing my next live stream this coming Wednesday. So please make sure you like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out the next time I host a stream or I post a video. Thank you so much, and I hope you have a beautiful day. Bye!